He argued with Goering. He interviewed Churchill, Neville Chamberlain, half a score of French premiers. He talked to Haile Selassie about the tragedy of Ethiopia. He questioned Maxim Litvinov about the Soviet intentions, and he wrote and wrote. One of the editors who looked forward to his dispatches was George Rogers.
Matthew Halton was probably the most brilliant foreign correspondent Canada ever produced. To a whole generation of Canadians, he was the most eloquent chronicler of our time, a man who could capture the sweep and the drama of history and tell of it in simple, majestic language any Canadian could understand. He had come from the small foothills hamlet of Pincher Creek in Alberta, a solemn, earnest young man with a burning mission to be a great reporter. When he died last week, he could be secure in the knowledge that his country had produced none greater. For 23 years, Halton roamed Europe and Africa and Asia, interviewing potentates and peasants, the great and the near great, the men of peace and the men of war. And from his typewriter flowed an enormous stream of words, some 4 million, he estimated recently. He illuminated the great events of an era in a manner so vivid and sharp that all who read him could feel themselves to be eyewitnesses of history. We are proud to have presented in the pages of the Star Weekly much of Matthew Halton's phenomenal output. In one of his articles 2 years ago, he wrote, "I have not been everywhere and seen everything, but I have been to most countries and seen much. I have been to Carcassonne and Karnak and Persepolis and Ceylon and Darjeeling. And I have seen so many of the world's famous places in astonishing and dramatic circumstances. Canadian journalism may never see his like again."
In 1934, Matthew Halton opened a report with a single short sentence. "Germany means war," he said. He was a man of peace, and when the war he had foreseen did come, he had to think and write about something that outraged every instinct in him. But it was his job, and he did it magnificently. He saw Finland crushed, and he covered the Desert War. And then in 1943, he became Matthew Halton of the CBC, and his voice became a vital link between Canadians at home and their men in Europe. He was with them as they stormed the rugged hills of Italy and crossed the countless rivers. He was with the men who landed in Normandy in 1944. Charles Lynch, now a CBC correspondent himself, was in Normandy, too.
Matt Halton was a veteran correspondent by the time D-Day came around in 1944, and I was the greenest man on the beach. He took the trouble to befriend the greenhorn and put things into perspective, and he did it with high humor and good fellowship. During the campaign, after breakfast, he'd say, "Well, let's go face death." And he faced it and reported it, and after the fighting was over, he worked as intensely as ever covering the peace. His curiosity was boundless, and his enthusiasms were as lively as his dislikes. I doubt very much if Matt Halton ever turned out a dull piece in his life. In latter years, I knew him chiefly through his letters, which were always an event when they arrived. Sometimes he was on a high-flying cloud. Sometimes his ballad was of the barroom kind. Now he's taken from us before his time, and we'll miss his letters, his broadcasts, and his visits.
"Let's face death," he said. And in some of his reports, you could hear death all around. It was in Normandy that he drove up to a forward observation post during the attack on Carpiquet airfield. Let's listen again to Matthew Halton as he spoke then.
"We were mortared getting in there. Sometimes the shells fell far away, and their coming sounded like the London air raid siren. Sometimes they fell a few yards away and came with a sobbing scream. Before 5 o'clock, at first light, we could see the hangars on Carpiquet Aerodrome and the village. For the next hour, we saw hardly anything. Within a few minutes after the barrage started, the objective below us and the fields were a dense cloud of smoke and cordite fumes. In the following recording, you'll hear German and Canadian machine guns, and German shells that fell on us, and my attempt to describe something of what I saw, and above all, the incessant, earth-shaking and atrocious pounding of the hundreds of guns. Fortunately for you, the sounds as recorded on a disc are quiet and tame compared to what they are when we hear them. Even bursting shells that shook us and blasted us sound pretty tame on a disc. Listen to this, and then imagine it at least 10 times as loud. And now 25 minutes have passed. 25 minutes of the most ferocious barrage I've ever seen. When I first spoke, we could see the hangars, and we could see the aerodrome in the first light of dawn. We could see the German strong points. But now there's nothing but the fog of war. And to be on this battlefield, one understands the meaning of the phrase, the fog of war. I sit here, or I stand here, in this observation post, an old farm, with 2 or 3 Canadian officers, 2 or 3 Canadian privates, and watch and wonder. All we can see is smoke and the terrible bursts of flame as one of the huge naval shells falls on the enemy positions. Occasionally, an enemy shell falls near us. And you can hear, as I speak, you can hear the chattering, this hard stuttering of the machine gun. And now I can see German flares going up. The nervy German. He must be nervy now under a barrage of scores, no less than scores of thousands of shells, sending up his flares. So apparently he's still thinking. As I said that, I could see tracer bullets from our machine guns going across our front. Now I can hear other machine guns farther away, as if from our troops who are advancing. Some of our tanks are going across the front, too. So this is the morning. After a night that was bad enough, this is the morning we waited for. A morning in France. A morning in which the fair fields of Normandy are torn and rent and split apart.
It was grim, yes, but not all of it, because that was impossible, both for the men who fought and the men who wrote. Don Fairbairn is another war correspondent who remembers.
It was a quiet moonlight night around the Canadian press camp, which consisted of a few tents and an apple orchard. Action at the front had been limited that day, and a few of us were relaxing over a card game. A game of chance in which the stakes were not high, but confusing because of the variety of money in use. A few intrepid souls had managed to smuggle in some English currency. There were no Canadian dollars, but there were French francs, on which nobody could place a positive value in those days, and occupation francs, which did have a definite value, in our pay books at least. For light, there was one small electric bulb run from a gas-powered generator. There had been sporadic artillery and anti-aircraft fire, but it didn't disturb the play, until suddenly a German aircraft dropped something on an ammunition dump close by. The light went out, and players, cards, and stakes scattered toward what little shelter there was in the tent. After a time, as the night grew silent again, there came a voice from under a table. It was Matt Halton saying, "I have 3 sevens and the butt of a candle."
He went through it all, the hard parts and the parts you could recall with a laugh afterwards. But of all his reports, the one he liked best himself was the day he could tell us that the nightmare was ended.
The German war is over. 5 little words that one hardly dares to speak. During long, weary years, and during hours that seem like years, one sometimes wondered if the carnival of death wasn't a nightmare. And now that the nightmare's over, one has to wonder if it isn't a pleasant dream from which we wake, to find the usual mad mornings of war and blood. Young men have grown old in a morning. Gentle men have grown calloused on slaughter. The best blood of a civilization has been poured away like red wine in an orgy. And then someone tells you it's over, and your first thought is, no more Canadians will die. Not again in this war will Canadians huddle against the wet earth of Europe in shuddering dawns, and then rise to their feet and move out into the storm of steel. Not again shall we see brave men who can stand no more. No more mounds of earth beside the road. The war isn't officially over, but the time has come to be glad. Life can begin again. The anger of the guns has died away. Songs can be heard again. spring can be spring. Today the sun rises as it hasn't risen for nearly 6 years. And soldiers I've talked to don't quite know what to do about it. They shave and have breakfast. They clean their guns. They try to brush the mud off their clothes. They ask if there's any mail. After all, they've lived strange, dangerous lives. It's hard to believe that no shells will come screaming over. It's hard to believe that if they stand up in the open, nobody will shoot at them. Death has walked at their side. It's hard to believe for a day or two that the nightmare is over and that they can drink the wine of life.
Yes, it was over. But the peace that Matt Halton, like all of us, had longed for wasn't an easy one. There was still work for Matt Halton to do. Andrew Cowan recalls the post-war years.
I worked closely with Matthew Halton for many years in the CBC's London offices. Closely, inasmuch as our offices were within a few feet of each other. But, like a good artist or craftsman, he was a solitary worker. When he wished to prepare a broadcast, he went into his office and shut the door. Alone with himself, he thought and wrote. He was an efficient worker. He assembled his clippings, his notes, his statistics before him, checked last-minute data, and then began to type. Like most efficient workmen, he went quietly about his job. He was so quiet about the office that most of the time we didn't know whether he was in or out. He never stormed about to relieve his feelings, or raised his voice in anger, or was rude with members of the office staff. Except on rare occasions, in fair verbal fight, I never saw him rude with anyone. Bores and yahoos he ignored. He cultivated his own sources of information quietly and in his own way. He didn't care much for press conferences. But Matthew Halton was the very opposite to a lonely or aloof man. His friends were everywhere, among his colleagues in the newspaper and broadcasting world, among writers, actors, artists, politicians, scientists, teachers, trade unionists, and people doing ordinary jobs. Matthew Halton never assumed that people doing ordinary jobs were just ordinary people. Quite literally, he walked with princes, nor lost the common touch. He was a personal friend of the Duke of Edinburgh. He took pride in his friendships, though he never boasted of them. His contact with the great didn't make him cynical, and he never betrayed their trust.
Yes, his friends were everywhere. Many of them in the British Broadcasting Corporation, because Matthew Halton's voice was almost as familiar to British listeners as it was to us. Winfred von Thomas knew him well.
I shall always remember Matt as the Canadian who, of all the many gifted Canadians who've come to report the British scene, knew and understood us best. He never forgot his pride and love of Canada. That cropped up in his conversation on all possible occasions. And I can still remember the sparkle in his eye when he used to talk about the Canadian West and its possibilities. He'd seize me by the arm and say, "Look, you want to get out there and see this thing for yourself. It's the biggest thing happening in the Commonwealth today." But he'd also come to feel himself completely a part of Britain, and above all, of London. He knew us in all our strengths and weaknesses, and in a wholehearted way, I think he'd almost come to love our very faults. I used to drive with him on many a Thursday down to a little group of journalists, editors, actors, and people in the know about current affairs who meet informally in the Thursday Club in one of London's best-known seafood restaurants. And Matt, by the way, was a connoisseur of oysters. Well, he was in his element here. He knew everybody worth knowing in London. He could always bring us the latest inside story, for he had that superb journalist's instinct for getting all the information he wanted from a man in the quickest and pleasantest possible way. And so at the Thursday Club, we all of us reveled in sharing in the wealth of his knowledge about the strange passing show of our public life. And I remember the last time we drove down there together, I was looking out through the taxi window on the crowded, narrow streets through which our car was struggling, and I said to Matt, "Look, doesn't this get you down occasionally? All this sprawl, this unplanned mess?" And Matt gave me one of his irresistible, quizzical grins. "Do you know," he said, "I wouldn't change it. I love it just as it is. It's got rare character." That, indeed, was what Matt had himself. Rare character.
Another of his friends was a man whose reputation for a stringent comment has made him a national institution in Britain, Gilbert Harding.
The first time I met Matthew Halton in Canada, where I was working for the BBC during the war, I tried to quarrel with him. I failed. The reason was that he was a Canadian who understood the English, and what's more, he understood Englishmen like me, the quarrelsome kind. I think that, from my point of view, that was his great secret. We exchanged quips. Pincher Creek, Alberta, I said to him. What an extraordinary place to come from. At least you remember what it was called, he said, whereas you come from Hereford, and we call your white-faced cattle Herefords. I had a great respect and a liking for Matthew Halton. He was a reporter and a journalist of the competent kind, and I am a man of no particular achievement. He was, I think, on the whole, more at home in London than even I am. He made much of us and much of the opportunities that London has to offer. We belonged even to the same clubs. Only one at a time, because I had to leave one. I couldn't bear the backslapping, but Matt didn't mind. If anybody slapped his back, he slapped back, which was more than I could. And now that he is dead, I remember with infinite regret that I was always his guest and never his host. And now it's too late.
Another familiar British voice, Richard Dimbleby.
It was after the war that I knew Matt simply as a family man, living happily with his wife and his 2 children, an ideal wife, and a boy and a girl of unusual charm and composure. I have a photograph at home taken at my daughter's christening, and Matt is there, glass in hand as we drank a toast, beaming down at her. I think he must have lived a very full and contented life with his family in their home just below Hampstead Heath, here in London. What wonderful summer evening parties they used to give on the terrace, outside the drawing-room windows, and on the lawn, when the heat and the noise of the day had gone, and the trees were thick and dark round the garden, and a gentle bubble of conversation rose into the dusk. It was there that you saw the breadth of Matt's friendships. Writers and politicians, poets, newspaper men and broadcasters, and somehow I would find myself at the keyboard of the piano, and a cross-section of the guests would gather round to shatter the evening peace with boisterous songs. And Matt was there, everywhere, the perfect host, witty, informed, interested in others, of deep sympathy, but of determined views. He had a great deal to do in life. He did part of it. The rest will never be achieved, and many people will be the poorer.
Matthew Halton, friend, host, husband, father. But always there was his work, in many ways inseparable from the man himself. Another memory here from Norman Depoe.
First time I met Matt Halton was in London, well after the war, and when I was still relatively inexperienced as the editor who had to deal with his reports. I approached him with some trepidation, a famous and polished foreign correspondent and a very green editor. But really, before anything could happen or we could talk to each other very much at all, someone else came into the office, and Matt Halton turned and said, "I'd like you to meet Norm Depoe. He's my boss." Matt Halton was like that. Looking at his reports as an editor, the thing that struck you was his ability to construct a colorful phrase that meant something. There's one that sticks in my memory especially. I don't recall exactly when he used it, but I know it was about one of those big post-war events that shaped history. The gale of the world. Just a phrase, perhaps, but one of those phrases that Matt Halton could use to make you know that this was one of the hinges of history. There was always something there in every one of his reports, a paragraph, perhaps a sentence, perhaps only a phrase, but always something that cut down through the rush of events that were happening today, right down deep to those dark, obscure forces that have troubled our time. The other thing about Matt was that he cared what was happening to humankind. I remember sitting with him in London one night, and we were talking about the Spanish Civil War, something that was already covered with the fine dust that history uses to dim old passions, and something that a whole generation of young Canadians knows only as a paragraph in a textbook. And yet, more than 15 years afterwards, you could hear the note of anguish in Matt Halton's voice as he recalled those days. He cared about human freedom, he cared about human dignity, and he cared about the simple human right to live a life at peace. And because he cared, he made us care too.
He was a many-sided man, impossible to sum up in a few words. One of his Canadian colleagues in London, though, thought that there was one part of Matt Halton that gave a basic clue to his character. Rooney Pelletier.
The eyes are perhaps the clue to this man's character and to the nature of his achievement. He was ever the reflective, kindly, but incisive inquirer. And his voice was doubtless the second clue, unmistakably Canadian, but somehow overlaid with the patina of something European. And both these clues perhaps explain why he could, with grace, ease, and real achievement, be a man born in Canada who made London the home of his choice and, quite calmly, took the world for his province.
Yes, the world was his province. King George VI awarded Matthew Halton the Order of the British Empire. That and his doctorate from his old university were only two formal tributes to his life and work. And now he's gone. And perhaps none of us can find words to do justice to him who knew and loved words so much. He loved quotations, too. He had a rich store of them, and he used them well. And so perhaps we can end with a quotation here tonight. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, "This was a man."